Welcome back, lovelies. Darian the Eclectic here, and today we're going to be continuing our series on creating a great scene. Now, the last video I did on this covered the first 5 points, and this video is going to be part 2, covering the last 5 points. So as a recap from part 1, what you need to do to create a great scene, the first 5 points, is 1, tell us when and where this scene is taking place. Number 2, tell us what the protagonist is thinking and feeling. Number 3, tell us what the protagonist wants and why. This is the goal, and remember, this can change as it goes through the scene, just like it can change as the protagonist moves through the entire story. Number 4, what's at stake if the protagonist succeeds, and what's at stake if they fail. And number 5, what's the inciting incident that gets in the way of the protagonist pursuing that goal. So now moving on to number 6. These are the progressive complications that increase the obstacles in the way of the protagonist pursuing the goal, that result in the protagonist having to make a decision and change course, pivot. Now, I got this from Brandon Sanderson on Writing Excuses. So if you want to know more about that process, he has a video series on YouTube, and he talks a lot about it in the Writing Excuses podcast. But for our example here, continuing from part 1 of the video with the casino heist, the progressive complications might be, once that inciting incident occurs, his team is in trouble, the heist mastermind, the team is in trouble, and now he's got to make a decision between continuing to pursue his goal of the heist, to get the money, to get the girl, to have the life that he wants, that she wants, and having to choose between sacrificing that and saving his team. Now, the progressive complications are going to be things that continue to get in the way. So every time the protagonist thinks that he's figured out a way to get both of those things, because the protagonist wants to have his cake and eat it too, right? And of course, to create a great story, we cannot give the protagonist everything they want. So the progressive complications are the things that continue to get in the way of the protagonist every time they pivot and think they figured it out. You might think of this as try-fail cycles, which it's referred to in a lot of other outlining materials. So those try-fail cycles are things that continue to force the protagonist to fail until they realize they have to make the choice. They have to sacrifice one for the other. And that's when they begin to succeed, is when they make that choice. Which brings us to number 7. And this is the climactic moment in the scene where the protagonist has to make a decision. And you need to provide choices for the protagonist, and they need to be equally bad or equally good. Again, this is where the sacrifice occurs. So the equally bad choices would be this protagonist having to either sacrifice their team to get their original goal of the heist and the girl, or sacrificing the heist, getting the money to get the girl in order to save the team. Those would be 2 equally bad choices. And the reason we want them to be equally bad or equally good is because that makes the decision more difficult for the protagonist. It would be an easy sell if the protagonist had a choice between something good and something bad. Obviously, the protagonist would choose the good. So we need to make this difficult for the protagonist, which makes it more interesting for the reader. Now, an example of 2 equally good choices might be like a kid in a candy store. The parents say you can only choose one candy, and so he has to choose between his 2 favorite, Jolly Ranchers or chocolates. He cannot have both. So that's the decision. That's the choice between 2 equally good choices that the kid has to make. And either way, they're sacrificing something still. So it's important that you provide either 2 equally bad, 2 equally good choices for the protagonist to make in order to move the scene forward in a satisfying way for the reader. Number 8 is the actual climactic moment where the character makes the decision. They choose between those equally bad or equally good choices in order to move the scene forward. This is a fairly straightforward part of the checklist. So, and it is the climactic moment. It's the choice that they make. They make that decision. And with that, remember to include what they're thinking and what they're feeling. It's really tough to make those sacrifices. So you gotta make it really juicy for the reader by including how painful this is for the protagonist to make this choice. Which leads us right into number 9. How does the protagonist feel about the choice they made? And what are the consequences of that choice? So again, the heist the protagonist now makes the choice to sacrifice the getting the money in order to get the girl to save his team. Now, what are the consequences of that? He's not going to get the money. Maybe they get caught. Maybe he has to turn himself in order to save his team. And that's the choice that he makes. And the consequences are he's going back to jail. And he's not going to get the girl because he's ended up right in the place where she left him previously. And then another part of that is, what's the plan now? Now that they've made the decision, now that they're moving forward with what they've chosen, what is the plan now? He's got to sit down and think through it. So, okay, I've got to turn myself in to save my team. I'm not going to get the money, which means I'm going to lose the girl and I'm going to go to jail. Okay, here's what I have to do. And outlining that gives us all the details of what the protagonist is thinking and feeling, again, but also how the story is about to move forward. And it increases that anticipation for the reader as we go along with the protagonist in this very painful decision, in this road where they feel like they're not going to be able to come back from. It feels like a great loss for the reader. And so we're going to go along for the ride in the hopes that the protagonist can somehow turn this around, somehow come out on top. And finally, number 10. And I get this from StoryGrid. So if you're not familiar with StoryGrid, go to storygrid.com and read some of their articles, get familiar with the process. But basically, this particular point is making sure that if the scene begins positively, it ends negatively. And then vice versa, if the scene begins negatively, it ends positively. This helps keep the reader moving through the chapters without everything getting monotonous. If every single scene starts negative and ends positive, one, it's really confusing for the reader, because if something good just happened, why is the next chapter now starting badly? It doesn't make a lot of sense for the story flow. But also, if you've got a lot of chapters in a row that are good, it tends to get boring for the reader. There's no reason for them to keep moving forward. And likewise, if you've got a bunch of scenes that are negative, it's distressing and exhausting for the reader. There's no up and down movement of emotion for them to continue moving forward. So you want to create that roller coaster of emotion for them that includes highs and lows, so that they have the excitement and anticipation of the highs and the rest and rejuvenation of the lows. I can make another video about how you can actually achieve those highs and lows to create a really satisfying story for the reader. But for this particular point, just make sure that if your scene starts on a positive note, it ends on a negative note. And if it starts on a negative note, it ends on a positive note. So for example, if we're using the heist scene, the protagonist might have had a win, right? They get past the first challenge in that heist, which is stealing the security badges, right? That's a win. But as soon as they get to the end of the chapter where they're going to use the security badges to get into the room, maybe for some reason they don't work. And again, they need to pivot. So at the scene will end with them failing to get into the room, or maybe getting caught by security, having to, in the next scene, figure out a way to talk themselves out of that situation. Now, there's a lot more that goes into the StoryGrid writing, editing process, and the main values of the story can be internal and external, and I can walk you through that in another video if you like. Let me know in the comments below if that's something of interest to you. Using those different principles makes it a lot easier to write your story. It helps give you that guiding light of what needs to happen and when. So it is really, really helpful. But for this, that is the last point in this 10 scene checklist. And just to recap the final 6, it's progressive complications that make the character have to continue to pivot and change the goal. It's that climactic moment where the protagonist needs to choose between 2 equally bad or 2 equally good choices in order to move the scene forward. It's the moment that they make that decision, how they think and feel, and what those consequences are now that they've made that decision, to include what is the plan now, what do they need to do to move forward. And then finally, if you're going to begin a story, or if you're going to begin the scene on a positive note, make sure you're ending it on a negative note, and then vice versa. If you begin on a negative note, end on a positive note. So If you enjoyed this particular two-part series, if you want me to make more videos about this, please let me know in the comments below. I would be happy to. I have a lot of experience with this with my MFA in creative writing and having written for decades. So if this is something you want to know more about, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video. Thanks, guys. Bye. Now there's a lot more. First fine. Five.